Good morning, teachers. Today's lesson, we're going to take a look at kind of the third or fourth lesson I do in Unit 4A. So today we're going to talk about fractional reserve banking, and kind of as an addendum to fractional reserve banking, we're going to talk about banking balance sheets, also known on the AP exam as T-charts. So this is a lesson that takes me essentially two 45-minute class periods, so this is at least 90 minutes worth of content. Between the delivery of the content itself and then a bunch of practice. So this is something that students are going to need to practice pretty heavily because they'll be asked to manipulate those T-charts on the AP exam. So don't cut them short on their practice time. They need guided practice and they need practice at home for homework as well. So I'll kind of walk through the way that I introduce this concept on this slide, and then we'll move to some of the other things that I talk to the kids about. And then we'll wrap it up with the way that I go about doing practice, which you can do it my way or you can do it your own way. As long as the kids are getting practice, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Guiding question number one that I'll always ask is, since we're introducing this concept of fractional reserve banking, a lot of times students have no idea what most of those words mean. So I found that it's useful to spend a couple of minutes talking about what the heck fractional reserve banking is. And this is a good time, if you haven't already introduced the concept of the reserve requirement or the reserve ratio, this is a really good time to introduce that concept as well. So essentially in the United States, because we have a fiat currency system, and because banks are allowed to lend out the deposits that people put into them, this is what's known as a fractional reserve banking system. And it's a system where banks are required to hold a partial amount of demand deposits actually in the bank vault in reserve, and they're allowed to loan out the rest. So for example, the current reserve requirement, as I'm looking at this, is 10%, which means that banks are only required to hold in cash 10% of their total accepted deposits, and in theory at least, they're allowed to lend out the other 90%. I'll tell you, in practice, it doesn't work out that way. So banks like to hold excess reserves. So even though they could theoretically lend out 90% of demand deposits, they won't actually do that. They'll lend out somewhere around 60 or 66%. But for the purposes of this course, because we're going to use this as kind of a jump-off point to introduce the money multiplier in the next lesson, let's just presume, because the AP exam presumes, that banks don't hold excess reserves and that citizens don't hold money in the form of currency, because both of those things will lessen the multiplier that we're going to learn about in the next lesson. So we'll just presume that banks lend out all 90% in this example that they're allowed to lend out, and that's going to help us to more easily understand the impact of that lending on the money supply and on the banking sector in general. Second big question that I'll introduce here is, why does it matter that we have a fractional reserve banking system? So we'll introduce what is fractional reserve banking, and then we'll be like, who cares? So why does it even matter that banks lend out some of your deposits? What impact does that have? And there's two big impacts. The first of which is that because we have a fractional reserve banking system, banks and thrifts actually create new money in the form of checkable deposits when they issue loans. Now that's kind of a complicated process, and it gets its own separate video. So we're going to do the next video, we'll explain all of that and how that works. But what the kids need to know at this point is that with fractional reserve banking, it's actually banks and thrifts that create money, not the Bureau of Engraving or Printing or not the U.S. Mint. Most of the money creation in our economy is done through banks and thrifts issuing loans, not through the creation of physical currency. More importantly for this lesson, if we have fractional reserve banking, that makes our banking system relatively complicated, and so it becomes really important that banks and the Fed keep track of their balance sheets or their T-charts, which is what we're going to spend most of this lesson going into. So if banks are only required to hold on to 10% of their demand deposits, for example, we need to make sure that they're holding on to all 10% of those to prevent things like bank runs or problems in the banking system like we saw in 2008. So what we're going to learn to do today is some basic accounting. One of the reasons we need to do basic accounting is because the fractional reserve banking system makes our system fairly complicated and potentially more risky than non-fractional systems. Question number 3 is, how does a balance sheet or a T-chart work? Essentially, this is accounting 101. All we're going to do for this is we're going to separate the things the bank has into two columns. They're going to be assets on the left-hand side, liabilities on the right-hand side. We'll want to define those. So assets are anything the bank owns that has value, or anything that is owed to the bank in the future. So these would be things like bonds or loans, things that the bank will be repaid at some future date. And we're going to treat liabilities as anything the bank owes to someone else and or will need to repay at some point in the future. So for example, those deposits that the bank has accepted, they're going to be considered liabilities to the bank because people are going to ask for their money back at some point in the future. The only thing that I found that students tend to be a little bit confused on for the purposes of assets and liabilities is we need to make sure that we stress to them that for the purposes of AP economics, we only ever care about the perspective of the commercial bank. So students tend to think about assets and liabilities in terms of whether things are assets and liabilities to them. And we need to get them away from that thought process. I always tell them, like, nobody cares about you on this exam. We care about the bank. So we need to make sure that things like loans, students always want to tell me that loans are a liability because they have to repay their student loans that they're going to take out next year. We cannot do it this way. So loans are an asset because loans are an asset to the bank, and it's from the bank's perspective that we actually care about. So make sure that you spend a minute or two addressing that it's not assets and liabilities to individuals, but assets and liabilities to banks that actually makes a difference here. Otherwise, they're going to get everything backwards and confuse themselves quite a bit. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. All right, the next thing we want to do is introduce the T-chart itself and talk about what goes in the assets column and what goes in the liabilities column. As of right now, I don't have a mnemonic device for this, so this is one of those things that students just have to memorize. The good news is these things won't change. So once they memorize what the 5 or 6 things that they find in the assets column are and what the 3 or 4 things that they'll find in the liabilities column are, then that's pretty much the information that they need. Because on the AP exam, what they'll do is they'll give them like a whole list of different things like mixed up, so there'll be assets and liabilities mixed up together, and then ask them to make the T-chart and put these things in the correct column. So in the grand scheme of things that we ask students to do in AP macroeconomics, this is pretty far down on the difficulty scale. So they just need to memorize what the assets of a bank are and what the liabilities of a bank are. And then once they've memorized what goes in each column, we can then start to manipulate the assets and liabilities and figure out exactly what that's going to look like. So what I want to do here is run through the main things I'll see in the assets column and the main things I'll see in the liabilities column, and talk briefly for the ones that I think require explanation as to why these things are in the column that they're in. We're also going to check this bank in just a second to find out if the bank is solvent, and that means the bank is basically okay. And we're going to define solvency with this bank as any bank whose assets are greater than or equal to their liabilities. For the purposes of the AP exam, pretty much all the time, they'll give the kids a banking balance sheet where assets are equal to liabilities. It's pretty rare that they'll give them assets and liabilities that don't line up. So as long as their liabilities are not greater than their assets, this bank is doing okay, and this bank is solvent. So let's start with the assets column. The 2 big things and the most important things that the kids will find on the assets column are your 2 different sets of reserves. So you're going to have required reserves, which is the percentage of demand deposits the Fed requires the banks to hold on to when they set the reserve requirement. So required reserves should always be some percentage of demand deposits, which you'll find in the liabilities column. Any cash that the bank is holding on to that they aren't legally required to hold on to by the reserve requirement goes into the second reserves account, or excess reserves. So basically, required reserves is whatever percentage of demand deposits the Fed has set the reserve requirement at, and then all the other money the bank is holding on to goes into excess reserves. And it's out of excess reserves that the bank can spend that money for investment, they can give out loans with that money, they can purchase bonds with that money, etc. So when we start to manipulate the assets a little bit later on, essentially almost all the manipulation comes from excess reserves, because the banks aren't allowed to touch required reserves since they are legally obligated to hold on to those based on their percentage of demand deposits. The one that students tend to have a little consternation with is going to be loans. So loans are an asset to the bank because those are basically, that's how banks make money. They bring in deposits, they give out loans at a high interest rate, they pay the depositors a low interest rate, and they keep the difference. This is a good point. If you haven't introduced the concept of the savings investment identity, this is a good time to talk about that as well, where savings equals investment in the economy. because banks aren't loaning out the bank's money, banks loan out depositors' money. And so the more deposits the bank is accepting, the higher their amount of excess reserves, and therefore the higher the amount of loans that they're able to give out are going to be. This causes students a little trouble because they want to think of loans as a liability, especially seniors who are about to take out loans next year. Just remind them that this is from the bank's perspective, and loans are a good thing for the bank because that is how banks make money. So a bank with no loans is not a bank at all. So it goes in the assets column of this T-chart. In addition to that, banks will pretty much always purchase bonds, or what sometimes are called T-bills, and these are treasury bonds from the U.S. government. Students will wonder why it is that banks would purchase bonds, especially since loans pay back a higher interest rate. You'll just need to tell them that banks will use bonds as a hedge against their loans not being paid back. So the U.S. government always pays back its bonds on time, every time, whereas people that take out loans maybe are a little bit more risky. They may not pay back their money, or they might fall into financial troubles on a mortgage or something like that. And so generally speaking, a lot of banks will hold a certain percentage of the amount that they have outstanding in loans. They'll purchase a corroborating amount of bonds to go along with that. And so essentially the bonds are a safe investment. They're going to give them a guaranteed return, whereas the loans are a risky investment that might pay them back a higher rate of return, but they might not, depending on the risk. So banks will hedge their risk by taking out both bonds and loans. And this is how you prevent, ending up like WAMU, where they had too many loans that didn't get repaid, and then the bank collapsed, essentially. The last thing that goes in the assets column goes by a bunch of different names on the AP exam, but it's essentially property owned by the bank. This could be anything from the building itself to their ATM machines to 3.6 million deposit slips. Anything the bank owns that has value and that could theoretically be liquidated in kind of a worst case scenario is going to go under their property, or sometimes it's called capital. Basically stuff that the bank owns that could theoretically be turned into cash. On the liability side of things, there's a lot less to know there. So the big liability that banks are all going to incur, all depository institutions, are going to be demand deposits. Sometimes these are called checkable deposits. And students need to understand that these demand deposits are a liability to the bank because they represent money the bank is going to have to pay back in the future. So when people put their money in the bank, they're going to demand that money back at some point, and the bank doesn't know exactly when. So theoretically, I could put my paycheck in the bank and then leave it there for 10 years and not ask for the money back. Or I could put my paycheck in the bank and spend it all within the next couple of weeks. And so since the bank doesn't know exactly when they're going to need to return these deposits, they're deposits that are returned on demand. We call these things demand deposits, or sometimes they're also referred to as checkable deposits, money in the checking account, which means essentially the same thing for the purposes of our exam. In addition to demand deposits, banks will also occasionally take out loans. And so when the bank is the one who's taken out the loan, it shows up in their liabilities column, whereas when the bank is the one giving the loan, it shows up in their assets column. I think students tend to make this a little more complicated than it necessarily is. So I would always point out that these are loans to the bank, and then I'll always point out who the bank can take out loans from, because there's two institutions they can get loans from here. They can take out loans from the Fed, at which they will pay the discount rate. Or, more often, they'll take out loans from other banks, for which they will pay the federal funds rate. This might be a good time to address the fact that the Fed, to most banks, is what we call the lender of last resort. So banks would much rather borrow money from other banks than from the Fed, because if banks borrow money from the Fed, the Fed's going to ask some uncomfortable questions. I usually tell the kids, would you rather borrow money from your mom or borrow money from your best friend? And the answer is always your best friend, because your best friend's not going to judge you, not going to ask questions. If you need $20, they can give you $20. Mom will give you $20, but she's going to ask all sorts of questions you may not want to answer. So this applies to the Fed as well. They'll borrow from the Fed when they have to, but only when other banks won't lend them money. Last but not least, in the liabilities column is the value of any stock that the bank has outstanding, especially if these banks are corporations. They have the ability to sell off portions of themselves, sell off equity in the form of stock, and we're going to count the value of that equity as a liability to the bank. for a whole bunch of reasons. Most notably, when people own equity in your company, they're entitled to dividends and they're entitled to their share of your profits. They're entitled to voting rights on your board, and they get to have a say in the way that your business is run. And so at some point in the future, these banks that have sold off equity, they're going to want to buy that equity back so they can stop paying dividends and so they can stop giving voting rights to shareholders. And so because at some point, theoretically, they're going to want to buy these stocks back, we're going to count the value of that outstanding stock as a liability against the bank because it represents money that they will at some point in the future want to spend to get back the portions of their company that they sold off in order to generate cash. The next thing that I want to do is take a brief minute to talk a little about something that my students have run into difficulty with in the past, and that's with the AP exam's terminology on these T-charts. So one of my big problems that I have with the way the AP exam tests eco kind of in general is that they tend to be relatively inconsistent with their terminology in a way that I think doesn't confuse higher performing students, but for students who are doing a good job of just memorizing stuff, changing up what you call things and changing up the words can really throw them off. So what I want to do is go through, I went through all the past AP exams for the last decade or so and wrote down all the different terms that each of these things has been referred to, and I want to just go over them briefly. This is something that when I first introduce the assets and liabilities, I'll go through and write down all of the possible terms that each of these things could be called, just so that the students have seen it before so that they don't get confused. And even some of these things that shouldn't confuse students, like referring to loans as customer loans, I found for some subsection of the population, it throws them off completely, seeing a slightly different term. So I just want to show them all of the possible terms to prevent them from getting really confused. So for reserves, sometimes they'll list it as reserves. Sometimes it's listed as total reserves. Most of the time, it's going to be broke apart between required reserves and excess reserves. And while I haven't seen this on the AP exam, I have seen some textbooks refer to this as cash on hand in their questions. So reserves, total reserves, cash on hand, they're all the same thing. And then they need to know the difference between required and excess. So don't let that throw them off. Loans are usually loans, but occasionally on the AP exam, they'll be customer loans for reasons I don't really know. One that they use a lot of inconsistent terminology on is going to be bonds. So sometimes they'll call them bonds. Sometimes they're referred to as treasury bonds. Sometimes they're referred to as T-bills, although I think they do that a lot less lately. Most recently, they've started to refer to these as securities. So they'll need to know that bonds are one example of a security, and they've also recently referred to it as government securities. So bonds, treasury bonds, T-bills, securities, government securities, they all refer to the exact same thing. They'll also refer to the resources owned by the bank as either property, or sometimes they'll refer to it as capital that the bank owns, which throws off the students because even at this point, after we've explained to them it's not, sometimes they think that capital still refers to money. And then on a recent AP exam, they referred to this as building and fixtures, and I know that really threw off the students. I don't know why they did it that way, but that was on the AP exam, so here it is. For liabilities, they'll refer to deposits as either demand deposits, which is mostly what they refer to it as lately. Occasionally, they'll also call them checkable deposits, and sometimes they'll just list them as deposits. For the outstanding equity in the company, there's a couple of different terms that they'll use for that. Sometimes it's listed as equity. Most often it's listed as owner's equity, but lately they've started to list it a little bit more commonly as net worth. So usually the way the AP exam has it lately is it's like owner's equity and then in parentheses net worth. So make sure that if they see net worth, that's a little bit of a weird way to go about talking about equity. Make sure that they know that that's the same thing as owner's equity. It's basically a stock outstanding, and it goes into the liabilities column. Good news is the loans really don't have other terms that they use for them. It's either loans or loans from Fed or loans from other banks. So that one's not confusing at all. So just take a minute to run through the terminology with the kids. That way they don't get something wrong that they know just because the terminology was a little different than what we did in class. All right. At this point, once I'm comfortable that they know all of the different things that go in the assets column and the liabilities column, and they understand kind of the basics of how the banking system works, this is the point where I'll usually walk them through at least one, maybe two different examples of what the changes to these assets and liabilities, these T-charts, are going to look like on the AP exam. And so the way I like to start off with this one is I'll start off with a blank T-chart, and then kind of we together will walk through the process of essentially doing basic accounting. So moving money from one account to the other. When I do this basic accounting with them that I'm going to walk you through here, I tend to go through and draw arrows showing like the flow of money in different colors. You don't necessarily have to go about doing that, but and I would encourage the students not to do it on the actual AP exam. But for the purposes of what we're going to do, since this is going to kind of be our first crack at doing some basic accounting, and since not all of the students are paying attention 100% of the time, I like to track these changes and actually like leave the changes to the accounts up so that if a student wanders off or their mind leaves for a couple of minutes and they come back, they can still kind of catch themselves up to figure out what they're doing. So when we're starting off with a blank T-chart over here, the first thing that needs to happen before anything else can occur is we need to tell the students what the reserve requirement's going to be for this economy, and then we need to start off with an initial deposit into the bank to kind of get things rolling. And so you'll want to make that initial deposit a pretty big number. That way you can then divvy up those dollars somewhere else. So for the purpose of this, I'm going to go ahead and start assuming a reserve requirement up here of 10%. That is what the actual reserve requirement is right now. And it's going to make for some easy math since we want to make sure that they can do this relatively quickly. So I'll walk you through as we do this. So the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to have demand deposits. And in this case, we're going to have a demand deposit of $100,000. And I'm writing 10,000. Sorry, we'll do this 100,000. You can see why I usually write these before I actually start narrating over them. Now, the big question that the students need to solve now is that since there's $100,000 in deposits showing up in this T-chart, the question then becomes how much of those dollars are going to go into excess reserves versus how much of those dollars are going to go into required reserves. So we'll come over here and we'll first figure out required, since that's going to be relatively easy. And students at this point should know that $100,000 times 0.1 times 10% is what's going to go into required reserves. Since we've chosen nice round numbers, it's fairly straightforward that required reserves are going to take 10 of the $100,000. And so this is going to be 10% of demand deposits. And so whenever demand deposits are going to change, that's the only time required reserves are going to change. Otherwise, that money is just going to sit there in the required reserves account and just be held onto by the bank since they're required. So if 10% of deposits are going into required reserves, that means that 90% of our deposits are now going to go into excess reserves. So we'll go here, do excess reserves, and that leaves us with $90,000. I will point out at this point that only deposits trigger the reserve requirement. And so make sure that the students know that if the bank gets money from anywhere other than a deposit, like the sale of stock or interest that gets paid back on their loans, that those additional dollars the bank gets are not going to be part of the required reserves there. So every single dollar they get from anywhere other than from a demand deposit is going to go into excess reserves at a rate of 100%. So we've got 10% going here, 90% going there, at least at the outset, leaving us with assets that are now equal to liabilities. So we have $100,000 in assets, $100,000 in liabilities, so our bank is now solvent. The next step in this practice process that I like to walk through is to make sure that the kids understand that anything that the bank is going to do, be it give loans or purchase property, all of that has to come out of excess reserves. Never does that stuff come out of required reserves. So the next best thing is we're going to say that the bank is going to give out a loan, and they're going to give out $50,000 in loans because that's how banks make money. And then we'll make the students do the math and figure out that that $50,000 in loans is going to come out of excess reserves. So if we had $90,000 and we subtract $50,000 in loans, then now we're still balancing here. So we still have $100,000 in assets and $100,000 in liabilities, but the makeup of the assets is going to be a little bit different at this point. So we actually haven't changed the balance of the account here. All we're doing is turning one asset in the form of excess reserves into a different asset in the form of loans. And then from there, we'll also spend some money on, let's say, property. So the bank wants to open up a new location, and so we'll make up some numbers here, and we'll say that that new location costs them $20,000. That's going to come out of the 40, and so that's going to leave us now with only $20,000 left in excess reserves. And then usually I'll say that, the bank is now going to take out some bonds in order to offset the risk from the loans. So we'll say that these are going to be T-bills here, or securities or bonds or whatever it is you want to call them. And let's say, just so that we can get our excess reserves down to zero, we'll say that these excess reserves, where they're going to spend all $20,000 in excess reserves on T-bills. So at this point, the student should be able to rebalance this account and show that we still have $100,000 in assets and we still have $100,000 in liabilities. At this point, you'll want to ask students how much additional lending the bank can do to test whether they know that lending comes out of excess reserves. And so the answer in this case, once we've done it this way, is there are $0 left that the bank is allowed to lend out, because the only reserves they have left are now required reserves, and they cannot lend money out of required reserves. At this point, now that we're down to $0 in excess reserves, we'll like to throw the students a bit of a curveball, and we'll ask them what happens in this bank when somebody who has deposited their money either spends their money or goes to make a withdrawal. So I'll tell them that we're now going to go from $100,000 in deposits, and somebody's going to withdraw $20,000. So we're going to have $20,000 out, which is going to leave us with $80,000 in demand deposits. And the question then becomes, where does that $80,000, or where did the $20,000 that they withdrew come from? Hopefully the students know that some percentage of that $20,000 is going to come out of required reserves, in this case 10%, and some percentage of that money is going to need to come out of excess reserves, in this case 90%. So 10% of $20,000 is going to be $2,000. So we know that their required reserves now are going to change. So now our reserve requirement is only $8,000, since $2,000 of required reserves is going to go toward that $20,000 withdrawal. But now we need to get the additional $18,000 from somewhere. And normally those $18,000 should come out of required reserves, or out of excess reserves. So it should be excess reserves is where the $18,000 is going to come from. But the problem is we don't have any excess reserves. So at our current situation, excess reserves is actually going to go into negatives. They have negative $18,000 to pay back this person who's withdrawn their money. We know that telling people they can't get their money to the bank isn't an acceptable solution, and so the question then becomes, when the bank runs into a situation where they don't have enough excess reserves to cover a withdrawal, what does the bank do about this? And this is where we'll introduce another liability, which is going to be loans to the bank. So in reality, if you try to take out money and the bank doesn't have enough, they will relatively instantaneously borrow that money from each other in order to cover, so that they don't have to tell you you can't have your money back. Because when a bank tells their customers they can't have their money back, it causes all kinds of stress and could potentially trigger a run on the bank, and they absolutely don't want to do that. So the question is, where is this $18,000 going to come from? And the answer is the bank is going to take out a loan. So this is going to be a loan from another bank. And in order to cover this withdrawal, they'll now need to take out $18,000 in loans from another bank. Students need to know that because this isn't a deposit, that $18,000 loan will go into excess reserves at a rate of 100%. So all $18,000 is going to go into excess reserves, and that those excess reserves will immediately be paid back out to the withdrawer of the cash. So they're going to be able to give this person back their $20,000, and everybody's happy. The bank still doesn't have any excess reserves, but at the very least they have covered their obligations to pay back these people their deposits. At this point, we'll kind of wrap up by adding in another wrench into their plans here. So now we'll be like, well, the bank doesn't have any excess reserves, but the bank really wants to be able to lend, because that's how banks make money. where other than loans could the bank get additional money into excess reserves that would allow them to loan it out? And the answer in this case is the bank, since they're a corporation, has the ability to sell out equity. So the bank can go onto the open market and they can sell owner's equity in the form of stock. And so let's say that they do a $20,000 sale of owner's equity. The value of that outstanding stock is going to be a liability because the bank is going to take on some obligations there to pay shareholders interest and to give shareholders voting power within the bank's decision-making structure. But they would need to know then that this $20,000 additional dollars that the bank got through equity is going to find its way into excess reserves as well, again at a rate of 100%. So there is no reserve requirement for this money because this money was not taken in the form of deposits, but rather was taken in the form of a sale of stock in this case. And so by the time we're all set and done, and I know this has gotten really messy, but you can erase on the whiteboard as you do it. I'm trying to leave it so that you can track what I did. When this is all said and done, we should now have $20,000, except I'm on the wrong color here, sorry. We should have $20,000 left in excess reserves at the end of this exercise, and all $20,000 of those dollars should be from the sale of owner's equity. And so at this point, now that we've drawn all the arrows and made it kind of ugly, I'll then erase the T-chart and then make the students do it themselves. So I'll walk them through the scenario of somebody's going to get a loan and the bank's going to sell equity, and make them track on both the assets and liabilities column where this money comes from and where this money goes. But I'll make them do it without all of these ugly arrows because the arrows are just there for the first time to make sure that they're able to track what I've done. So hopefully this particular little practice made some sense to you so that you can walk through the students with it. It would be very helpful at this point to also, if you go on the AP Pilot, you can download a whole bunch of different FRQ questions. So what I'll do is I'll go and I'll set it to the banking sector, and I'll just click on every FRQ that has a little tag there that says it's a table, because almost all of the table-based questions for this unit are going to be T-chart and multiple deposit expansion questions, and that's a good way to go about testing it. So make sure that they do some practice FRQs here as well, so they can see what this actually looks like on the AP exam to make sure that they can do the relatively simple math and relatively simple accounting that we're asking them to do. So apologies, this video was a little bit long, but hopefully it was helpful to you guys. I'll do my best to get the multiple deposit expansion video made as soon as possible. But thank you for sticking with me for all this time, and I hope you all have a great day.